Les bleus sont là, le canon gronde, dites les gars, avez-vous peur? Nous n'avons qu'une peur au monde, c'est le français, notre Seigneur.
Greetings. In this video, I will talk about the peasant uprising in the Vendée against the revolutionary government from 1793 to 1796. So, what do we mean by the term Vendée? The Vendéan uprising encompassed 4 departments located in the northwest of France, along and south of the lower reaches of the Loire. Among them was the Department of Vendée, which gave its name to the entire area of the uprising. Most of the territory, the so-called bocage, was covered with numerous groves, villages, and isolated huts, surrounded, like the fields, by hedges and ditches. Narrow, sunken roads ran between them, becoming almost impassable in rainy weather. About 800,000 people lived in this area, predominantly peasants living on isolated farms. The only place where neighbors could communicate was the church, where they came for Sunday Mass. The community formed around the parish, and the parish priest was an unquestioned authority for the peasants. He helped the peasants solve problems with the authorities, acted as their judge and notary, advisor, and source of news, which he conveyed to the peasants in his own interpretation. There were no large cities in its territory. The Vendée was a rural area bypassed by all the main roads, which made it largely isolated from the rest of the country. The nobles generally lived on their estates and were close to the peasants, unlike the nobles of other departments who preferred to live in cities. Peasants viewed urban residents, petty bourgeoisie, cunning merchants, and especially officials from whom all troubles originated, with suspicion. Nevertheless, the Vendeans were not initially opposed to the revolution, and welcomed the anti-feudal legislation of the Estates General. However, the brazenness of the new revolutionary authorities, and especially the anti-clerical legislation, caused significant discontent among the peasants of the Vendée. On July 12, 1790, the civil constitution of the clergy was enacted. According to this law, bishops were to be elected like ordinary officials, and the law did not require voters to be Catholics. Bishops appointed parish priests. Most importantly, clergy were required to swear an oath in the presence of municipal authorities. From the perspective of a typical believer, this law essentially killed religion. A priest should primarily believe in God, not in civil society. The clergy, and a significant portion of the faithful, did not accept this reform. Only 5% of the clergy took the oath in accordance with the new law. The rest remained non-jurors. The Vendeans met the new oath-taking priests with hostility. They were demonstratively humiliated. Their dogs were killed. Their doors and windows were shot at, and their services were boycotted. In contrast, the faithful flocked in crowds to the non-juring curés. Moreover, the Jacobins introduced the so-called cult of reason, accompanied by carnivals, parades, the looting of churches, the coercion of priests to renounce their orders, and the destruction or desecration of Christian sacred objects. In 1794, the cult of reason was replaced by the cult of the Supreme Being, introduced in accordance with Rousseau's views. Although it was somewhat milder than the previous one, it still had an anti-Christian orientation. The peasants of the Vendée could perceive attempts to introduce these cults solely as the rampage of Satanists. The immediate cause of the uprising was the forced conscription into the Revolutionary Army. In early 1793, the convention, fearing an invasion by Allied armies, decided to conduct a new draft of 300,000 men. However, the people of the Vendée had no desire to spill blood for a godless government. As the participants in the uprising said, "They killed our king, drove out our priests, sold the property of our church, consumed everything we have, and now they want to take our bodies. No, they will not get them." On March 4, 1793, in the town of Cholet, the youth dealt with the commander of the local National Guard. A week later, on March 10th, opponents of the draft clashed with Republicans in the commune of Machecoul. The insurgents acted with exceptional cruelty. They captured 400 prisoners, who were tried and executed over the next few days. The prisoners were chained and forced to dig ditches in the fields, after which they were shot so that they fell neatly into the graves. For several days, the bells in all the parishes of the Vendée rang incessantly, and about 100,000 peasants took up arms. On March 15th, a detachment led by a certain Jacques Cathelineau captured Cholet, taking up to 700 prisoners and 4 cannons. This man, as they say, was a commoner, a cloth merchant, who after the capture of Cholet became extremely popular and effectively led the rebel army. The Catholic and Royal Army of the Vendée was formed, uniting up to 40,000 people and posing a serious threat to the blue troops. It marched under a white banner with lilies and the motto, "Long live the King." The soldiers of this army wore a monastic shoulder pad and an image of the Divine Heart and the cross in flames. The fighters were bound by blood ties and informal connections. They were relatives, friends, neighbors, all of whom knew the area well and accurately chose their captains. Initially, the army was armed with pitchforks, scythes, clubs, and hunting rifles. However, over time the Vendeans became well armed with captured weapons. A significant drawback of this army was its seasonal nature. During the most intensive agricultural work periods, the soldiers would go home, and after completing their work, they would return to their units. However, the army also included permanent detachments of deserters from the Republican Army, and even foreign mercenaries. In the initial stage, as I already mentioned, the commander of the Vendée army was Jacques Cathelineau, initially as an informal leader. On June 12, 1793, he was elected Generalissimo of the Catholic and Royal Army. This choice was unanimously supported by all the Vendean commanders. The Vendean success was aided by the fact that the Republicans had very few forces in this province. However, after the mass mobilization of 1793, the Republican government gained the ability to transfer troops to the rebellious departments. Despite the defeats, by August 1793, 30,000 soldiers and National Guardsmen were suppressing the uprising. By November, this number had increased to 50,000, 70,000, and by February 1794 to 70,000, 100,000. In the autumn of 1793, the Mainz army, consisting of battle-hardened veterans who had fought serious opponents like Prussia and Austria, was transferred to the region. It is easy to guess that the chances of the insurgents achieving victory were virtually non-existent. However, let's return to a brief summary of the main events and battles. Enthusiastic about their initial success, the Vendean leaders decided to take the War of Liberation beyond their province and attack the city of Nantes. Capturing it would secure them access to the sea and provide a base for further advances. The attack on Nantes by the insurgents began on June 26th. However, despite their overwhelming numerical superiority, 38,000 against 12,000, the assault on Nantes was repelled, and the commander of the insurgents, Jacques Cathelineau, was mortally wounded in street fighting. The demoralized Vendeans lifted the siege. On July 14th, the insurgents elected a new commander-in-chief. The new generalissimo became Maurice d'Elbée, a representative of the French nobility who had previously commanded one of the major rebel detachments. Under his leadership, the Vendean troops won several victories over the Republicans, but suffered a devastating defeat at Luçon. In this battle, which took place on August 14th, d'Elbée managed to lead the Vendeans out and saved them from complete destruction. On October 17th, in the Battle of Cholet, the Vendean army faced a severe setback, and its leader was seriously wounded and transported for treatment to the island of Noirmoutier. In January 1794, Republican troops landed on the island. All the Vendean prisoners, including Delbé, were executed. Unable to walk, he was carried on a chair to the square and shot while seated. In the same battle, another prominent leader of the insurgents, Marquis Charles de Bonchamp, was killed. He received a fatal wound to the chest. The retreating Vendeans carried him with them and swore to avenge him, promising to kill 5,000 Republican prisoners. However, the dying Bonchamp ordered them not to do so. After the deaths of Delbé and Bonchamp, the command was given to a representative of the noble aristocracy, Henri de Vergier, Count of La Rochejaquelein, who was known as Monsieur Henri. I must admit, the very idea of creating a video about the Vendée Uprising came to me after I accidentally saw his portrait by Pierre Guérin, which I include here. My previous perception of the rebels did not match the romantic image of their commander. However, in reality, Monsieur Henri was no less romantic. In one of his orders to the army, he wrote, "If I advance, follow me. If I retreat, kill me. If I die, avenge me." His mere presence on the battlefield inspired the Vendeans, often saving them from defeat in nearly hopeless situations. Meanwhile, the Republican army was growing stronger and stronger. Under pressure from government forces, the Vendeans decided on a desperate move. The Catholic army left the Vendée, crossed the Loire, and invaded Normandy. This march became known as the Virée de Galerne, turn of the northern wind. The insurgents aimed to capture the coastal town of Granville, where they hoped to meet an English fleet that was supposed to land troops. However, they failed to rally the peasants of Normandy against the Republic. Granville was not taken, the English did not land, and the remnants of the Catholic army began retreating to the Vendée. During this retreat, the army was completely defeated, and its commander, Monsieur Henri, was killed at the age of 21 on January 28, 1794. It seemed that everything was over. The heroic saga of the uprising had come to an end. However, the leaders of the Republic conceived the idea of severely punishing the peasants of the Vendée in order to permanently deter them from rising against the revolutionary government. In January 1794, the new commander of the Republican forces, Louis-Marie Turreau, moved on to the Vendée with 12 columns totaling 15,000 men. Each of these columns, later known as the Infernal Columns, marched in different directions through the Vendée, indiscriminately burning villages and crops, killing livestock, looting homes, and raping and murdering women and girls. Vendeans were impaled on bayonets, infants were cut down with sabers, and peaceful people were burned alive in their homes. They even killed Vendeans, who remained loyal to the Republic. The justification was that anyone who remained in the Vendée must be a traitor, as all true patriots would have long fled. The cruelty displayed by the Infernal Columns shocked even many Jacobins, who were by no means averse to killings, and in March 1793 the action was halted and Turreau was recalled from the Vendée. But it was already too late. The peasants of the Vendée realized that they could not remain passive, and the uprising flared up with renewed vigor. Now it was led by the former forester Jean-Nicolas Stoufflet and the former naval officer François Athanas de Charette. They had actually commanded separate rebel units from the very beginning of the uprising. They managed to continue the guerrilla warfare, often quite successfully, and on February 17, 1795, a ceasefire was signed between the Republicans and the insurgents in La Jonay. France was led during this period by much more moderate individuals than the Jacobins, and the terms of the ceasefire were quite lenient. The Vendeans were to be compensated for all material losses. freedom of religion was declared, which meant the return and legitimization of services for the non-sworn priests, and Republican troops were withdrawn from the Vendée. But this time, the leaders of the Vendeans, Jean-Nicolas Stoufflet and François Charette, made a mistake by reigniting the uprising in June. Coming to the aid of the insurgents on June 23, 1795, French royalists landed on the peninsula of Quiberon under the leadership of Count Artois, future King Charles Dras, accompanied by an English brigade of Marines. However, the French forces in the Vendée were commanded not by just anyone, but by one of the Republic's finest generals, Louis-Lazare Hoche. In suppressing the uprising, he did not resort to terror and managed to maintain the neutrality of the majority of the population. By July 20th, the main rebel forces had been defeated, and by the end of the year, their remnants as well. In February 1796, Stoufflet was executed in Angers, and in March, Charette was executed in Nantes. With their deaths, the war in the Vendée came to an end, although Vendée's resistance did not cease. The region rose up several more times in 1799, 1814, and again in 1815, against Napoleon's return during the 100 Days period. And finally, let's figure out who is to blame for this bloodshed. The ideals of reason, freedom, equality, and brotherhood proclaimed in Paris in 1789 were hardly understandable to the illiterate peasant, and the reforms of the new government brought him no benefit. The Vendeans did not accept either agrarian or anti-clerical reforms, nor the execution of the king, nor the mass terror unleashed by the Jacobins. The Tree of Liberty, the raging crowds of Paris, the public executions by guillotine, were perceived by the Vendean peasants as some kind of pagan revelry, a bacchanal, the emergence of administrations composed of outsiders, Republican city dwellers, and the replacement of old priests with clergy, who swore allegiance to the new authority only reinforced such understanding of what was happening. On the other hand, revolutionary figures, inspired by the ideas of the Enlightenment, shared many of their mistakes. These philosophers were filled with deep hatred for Christianity and contempt for the foolish, ignorant peasantry. Following Jean de la Bruyere, who considered peasants wild animals, an extensive literature of Enlightenment thinkers described peasants as people steeped in ignorance, a kind of beasts. Voltaire suggested that savages should be considered rascals living in miserable huts with their wives and domestic animals, speaking an unknown jargon in cities, having few ideas, and, as a result, few emotions, gathering on certain days in a sort of barn to celebrate ceremonies they do not understand. And the naturalist Georges Buffon was even inclined to distinguish between different types of people within the territory of his own state. Among us, wrote this researcher, the rural inhabitants are much more unsightly than the city dwellers. However, even peasants as a whole are not all the same. In developed agrarian regions, they are nimble, lively, well-built, and spirited. On the contrary, representatives of backward areas had a reputation for being coarse, heavy, poorly built, and stupid. It is not surprising that during the Revolution, administrators of the Vendée department characterized its inhabitants as submissive, trusting, and self-contained egotists. Deprived of communication with the outside world, they know nothing except their plows, lords, and priests. Hence the unimaginable cruelty shown by the Republicans in suppressing the uprising, the belief that ignorant peasants would never fit into the ideal and rational society they were trying to build. With this, I conclude the tale of the uprising in the Vendée. Goodbye.